On Raglan Road of an autumn day, I saw her first and anew.
Ladies and gentlemen, good morning. It's my great pleasure to be here, and I'm very happy to take your questions on European identity. But I looked at the list that came with the invitation to join you in this splendid location today, and I realized that I may be the first Irishman privileged to speak at such an event. So at the risk of some disappointment, but we can come to the European part as you wish, permit me to talk a little bit about unlimited identity and an Irish perspective to begin with on that piece. I love the topic, but it is, of course, unlimited in its possibilities. And so I've been debating with myself since the invitation, which avenue should I travel? So I invite you now to accompany the one I have chosen. Our identity, our faces, public and private, social and political, historic and geographic, cultural and religious, today can have two dimensions: the real public and private, and the virtual. So the complexity already has multiplied in our world. I have a strong belief in the value of place and the anchoring of identity. Many years ago, Umberto Eco, asked where he was from, answered, "Quando sono a Roma, sono milanese. Quando sono a Parigi, sono italiano. Quando sono a New York, sono europeo." And so, place and identity are complex and correlative in the way that Umberto Eco has so described. Our sense of place is also about the repositories of history, which is institutional, constitutional, political, familial, and societal. A place of memory. But I want to use some Irish literature as my signpost for my remarks. And so my first reference is to one of our beloved dramatists who died just a few weeks ago, a man called Brian Friel. And like all good dramatists, they hold up a mirror to a society in which you see yourself through their writing in a different way. And Friel reminded us that memory sometimes becomes confused for us because we have an imagined sense of the past which constitutes the stuff of memory, which may not actually be the past as it was lived and understood. And so my choice today of that piece of music, of which you heard very little, was a ballad. And the ballad set to music a poem by an Irish deceased poet called Patrick Kavanagh. The poem is called Raglan Road. It's a lovely leafy suburb in Dublin. And this was a countryman, an older man who lived in the city. And the poem is about his love in his imagination for a beautiful young woman, a student. But it's in his mind. It never really existed. But he allowed himself the fragility of the relationship. I want to quote just a little piece from it. You didn't hear it there. He said, "I gave her gifts of the mind." It was in his imagination. He said of his relationship in his mind, "I saw the danger, yet I walked along the enchanted way, and I said," as he anticipated would never be fulfilled, "I said, let grief be a fallen leaf at the dawning of the day. I am Irish, I'm proud of it, and literature and drama and the written word is a very important part of our identity and who we are. I want to talk to you about a characteristic that I share with many Irish men and women of my age and generation, born in the 50s, left school in the late 60s, university in the 70s. I was the first member of my extended family, including my mother, my father, my parents, my grandparents, my aunts, my uncles, ever to step inside the front door of a university. And many of my generation were likewise. And their failure to do it and my possibility to do it was the gift of circumstance and opportunity and enlightened public policy. And my parents' and grandparents' absence from the halls of academe had nothing to do with an intellectual inferiority, had nothing to do with their appetite for life, but everything to do with the opportunity which society gave or failed to give. And so the first point I want to make to you is that opportunity matters powerfully when we deal with social challenge and transformation, and it should always be high on our list of priorities. Mine is a country which was long colonized and which had for many generations a streak of rebellion. And the rebelliousness eventually led to independence, and no sooner had it done so than it led to a civil war, unhappily. We had more than a century, all of the 18th century and into the first quarter of the 19th century, where Catholics in Ireland couldn't have an education, couldn't enter a liberal profession, and couldn't go to a university in their own home country, a form of internal apartheid, although we didn't have the word in those days. We had a devastating famine, 1845 to 1848, whose shadow still hangs sometimes like a cloud over our collective consciousness and memory, both in its good and bad parts. We had in Northern Ireland, for 30 years, the curse of terrorism. Let me pause here to do with my self-identity and those few remarks. I had the great privilege to represent my country on 3 occasions in the European Parlement, and to have been, in the end, privileged with the possibility to lead a group and to lead that Parliament. And when I went to move from the group to the parliamentary leadership, I had a campaign. And who do you talk to? Your electorate. And who are your electorate? The colleagues in the Parliament and back in their home countries, their leaders. And without naming names, I found it, frankly, annoying. I could use other less polite words, that so many chose to stereotype me, an Irish Democrat, as possibly being soft on terrorism because my country was plagued by it. Please do not let us stereotype classes of people to do with the choices of elements of that class to do with militarism and terrorism and so on. We gained our independence in 1922. We were politically free, but economically unfree. We remained locked in a post-colonial relationship with the United Kingdom. We exported there. Our labour market was almost a common labour market. Our immigrants went there and worked there. We were the poorest region of the British regional economy. And then we took the chance with Britain in 1973, after a referendum in Ireland in 72, 84% voting to join the then European Economic Community. We signed up for change. And joining that European Economic Community, we did so as an island people separated by geography, but connected to Europe by culture, by history, by values, by interests, and through our referendum by choice. In terms of identity, we have many debates on Europe and have had many referenda. If in Britain they are fatigued by the absence of referendum, in Ireland we are fatigued by the excess of referenda on Europe, of which we have had 10 since 1972. But in terms of identity, I want to make to you this point, both of myself and I think of and for my country. We were not obliged and are not obliged by our European engagement to be less Irish. But we are permitted by that engagement to be more effective as Irish in a broader space. And so the issue of setting the European and the national identity as having to be conflictual, of course there are issues, and we can again explore those. But deep down, the two offered high complementarity. I think you know in the Netherlands, we certainly know in Ireland, that when you're a small state, you cannot suffer from the excesses of sovereignty illusion to do with your weightiness in global affairs. And so by pooling some of your sovereignty, you do it not to deny it, and if you fought for it, you do it not to abandon it, you do it to enhance it. And it is the enhancement of the sovereignty of our small state that has been the attractive part of Europe. We have a huge Irish diaspora, starting with the famine and the millions who went. 40 million in the census in the United States claim an Irish ethnicity, and I'm sure some millions claim Dutch as well, because we all went there and met there and found a place there. But we had a big debate during the hubris of our so-called Celtic tiger, the time when we thought we could walk on water, but we discovered we were not Jesus. And in the end, we started to drown in the very thing we thought we could walk on. But we had a debate at that time. Were we closer, a nice image, to Boston, US, enterprise, all of those things, closer to Boston, and the history, all the Irish who were there, or to Berlin? Interesting debate. It wasn't Boston or Brussels. It must have been a premonition that the weightiness of Berlin, which then hadn't played all of its institutional weight, was waiting us around the corner. I thought that was an interesting debate, but I never really bought into it. Because if you figure it out, if you're an island in the Atlantic on the western seaboard of Europe, it is Boston and Berlin. Embrace both. Take all their energies and drive them as opportunity for your people and for your future. And so I've never had that sense of the yin and the yang, of the pull east and west, because you mobilize all the available energies. I would say, to do with the Ireland of my childhood, that past is another place, and we've gone through really enormous change. And here I want to talk, because we will talk about, I saw earlier, the wonderful debate and the questions and answers about the refugee crisis. I want to say this: if we want to preserve the best of who we are and to keep our traditions and values as we understand them to be, these must be living things. We cannot put them in a jar of formaldehyde and sit them in the museum and come every so often and genuflect before them. They are living things to change with circumstance and to evolve, but to maintain and retain their essential meaning. Let me turn to literature again. I recommend, if you haven't read it, a wonderful book by Giuseppe Tomasi Lampedusa, Il gatto pardo, the leopard, although I think it's a smaller cat in Italian than a leopard would be in the English language. A portrait of Sicily's fading, genteel aristocracy at the time of the Risorgimento and of Garibaldi and the wars and the unification. And the question was, how could they keep what they had as everything around was changing? And the key insight of this piece of literature comes from the beneficiary of it, Tancredi, who says, "Se vogliamo che tutto rimanga com'è, bisogna che tutto cambi." If we wish things to stay the same, we need everything to change. There is in that piece of literature a wonderful and rich insight. To keep what we value, it must go with the times, but not to abandon its essential worth, but to interpret its continuing relevant quality over time. When I was a young MEP, again to do with reading, we had the dreadful conflict in former Yugoslavia. I read all those reports that came to the European Parliament. I read those books that come quickly from good journalists on the ground who wrote about the fracture zone. The fracture zone is this geological place that has earthquakes. This place that was the boundary between Orthodox Christian civilization, Western Christian civilization, and Ottoman Muslim. And it was the place of divided ethnicities. And boy, did it divide at that time. But I couldn't find anything that really explained it to me. And then someone recommended an author, Ivo Andrić. If you want to understand what happened in Yugoslavia, read Ivo Andrić. The Bridge Over the River Drina, published in 1948, won a Nobel Prize for Literature in '64. I read that book, and then I understood. Because sometimes with sociology and anthropology and economics and all the things, and I'm an economist, that we do, gives us a surface treatment. But as Isaiah Berlin, the great historian in Britain, said, to understand properly the surface, you must study the geology underneath. Why are there high mountains and low valleys? You won't find out by only looking to the surface. And Andrić culturally was under the surface, bringing it up. He wrote one thing, many things, I will quote one. It stayed with me like a haunting prophecy. Bear in mind, I'm a young MEP reading this in 1998. He wrote this prophetically in 1948. He said, there are hurricanes of hatred awaiting their hour of expression. Hurricanes of hatred awaiting their hour of expression. And we were witness to those hurricanes blowing across former Yugoslavia and our continent. So the role of literature, very high, if you want really to understand. And then complexity. I meet people that say, well, all you Irish are Catholic. This is nearly true. 84% of us in our recent census said we're Catholic. Well, we're kind of Protestant Catholics because we're pretty individual in what we do and don't do. And most of us are Catholic, but not most of us go to church and follow the orthodoxies. Most of us are Catholic, but a great majority of us in the biggest attended referendum ever in Ireland voted as the only state in the world by plebiscite to validate same-sex marriage. And so even when you have a phrase like you're all Catholic, this too is a thing in a process of transformation and change. And we value some things, which is why we say it, because they had a meaning and a context and a value. But they are reinterpreted to do with the times we're living in. Like il gatto pardo, like the leopard, you change some way to remain the same. What has happened in Ireland is that the Catholic Church as an institution has had to step down from the weighty orthodox of its magisterium that insinuated itself into politics and constitution, and stand back after the revelation, here also in Netherlands, of child sex abuse covered up by the institution, shamefully, which then robbed it of a moral authority in that domain, and which now makes it a humbler church. And like il gatto pardo, its humility may be its saving, because it too needs to change and to rediscover the Sermon on the Mount, more than the sermonizing to do with the political process to which it had succumbed. Today, the refugee crisis, and I'm going to finish on this if I may, will come with questions and I look forward to it. Unmanaged, it would be chaotic. So let's come to that. What I want to take as a starting point and then the end point of this part of my remarks, I'm going to quote you a poem. It's not very long, It's about our famine. It's about our refugees today. It's about our common humanity. And it tells me, through literature, something that I feel deeply and that is felt deeply by Irish with our folk memory of what happened. Let me read it and judge for yourself. In the worst hour of the worst season, of the worst year of a whole people, a man set out from the workhouse with his wife. He was walking. They were both walking north. She was sick with famine fever and could not keep up. He lifted her and put her on his back and walked like that west and north until at nightfall, under freezing stars, they arrived. In the morning, they were both found dead of cold, of hunger, of the toxins of a whole history. But her feet were held against his breastbone. The last heat of his flesh was his last gift to her. Let no love poem ever come to this threshold. There is no place here for the inexact praise of the easy graces and sensuality of the body. There is only time for this merciless inventory, their death, together in the winter of 1848. We do not need to turn our hearts to stone. We need to animate our common humanity. And we need to do it, of course, in a systematic and managed way. But if we want to be the best of who we are as Europeans, its manifestation will be do the best, to be the best not for ourselves, as a nation, as a region, as a person, to try to be, sometimes, the best for the world and not for the self. Thank you.